President Mark and Rotarians, it's my great pleasure to introduce David Rutherford as our speaker today. David is the Chief Human Rights Commissioner. He comes to us with a very varied career. Many of you will know him or know of him. He's spent a lot of time assisting disabled people in sporting endeavours, in mainstream sport, including chair, I think, of the New Zealand Rugby Union. He's a lawyer by training and has practiced law in both New Zealand and Canada. He's worked in the area of the prevention of bullying and with a focus on discrimination. His topic today will be human rights challenges for New Zealand, and I'd ask you to join me in welcoming David.
So it's good to be here. Let me just see if I can get starting. What I wanted to do today, and I'll just cover a few things about why I chose this. I did meet three of your colleagues earlier this year, and we talked a lot about one of the areas of human rights challenge in New Zealand, which is the area around housing, health, education and income. For really a small but important group of people who are largely children and in many cases one-parent families. And I'm not going to talk about that today, not because it's not important, but because I want to talk about something else. And I think one of the interesting things that happened in the last couple of weeks for me was I was in Geneva talking to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and we were reflecting on the fact that governments around the world are retreating from their international obligations, encouraged by certain things going on in other parts of the world. But what is absolutely amazing is the rate at which business is charging in to fill that gap. And we're talking very big business, the Unilevers, the Adidases, the Coca-Colas, the Danones and those sorts of companies. And we're seeing it in New Zealand with Fonterra, Zespri, Warehouse, lots of big corporates running into the human rights space, because actually if you want to have an internationalist agenda and you want free trade, you've got to get some of this stuff right to underpin that, and they understand that. So I just also wanted to acknowledge Oscar here today, because GQ Hotels is one of the leaders in the actual doing of human rights in New Zealand in relation to people with disability. And again, this is not sort of charity or even corporate social responsibility. This is really, really good business. Zed, who also do that, tell me that in some of their franchises, franchisees are saving hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and the reason they save it is on staff retention. They don't need to go out and constantly recruit new people. You know, so there's people in this room who are leading the way in the realisation of human rights in New Zealand. And then the other thing I've done, which will surprise those of you who played rugby with me or went to university with me, given what I got up to in those days, I've just finished a stint as the patron of the recruit wing of the New Zealand Police. And there are 40 policemen now in New Zealand that are completely immune from anything I might do, because I'm completely conflicted having seen them go through the process from recruits to becoming constables. And I shared with them some words of Her Majesty the Queen, which she made on the launch of the Commonwealth Baton, which is the Commonwealth Games equivalent of the Olympic flame. And the baton will come through New Zealand just before Christmas. And what Her Majesty said was directly relevant to the oath that those constables take to keep the peace and uphold the rule of law. And that is really what human rights work is at its base. So Her Majesty said last week, the cornerstones on which peace is founded are, quite simply, respect and understanding for each other. Working together, we build peace by defending the dignity of every individual and community. By upholding justice and the rule of law, And by striving for societies that are fair and offer opportunities for all, we overcome division, find reconciliation, so the benefits of progress and prosperity may be multiplied and shared. You know, and that's a woman, as you know, who's pretty well seen it all. And it's just so clear and so straightforward, and that is what human rights at its base is all about. And one of the things that I've really reflected on a lot when I've talked to people is let's just focus a little bit on the responsibility of all of us to uphold those rights and the dignity of others, rather than the legal obligations that states have. Because that is where you can make a difference. And one of the reasons I want to talk about violence, abuse and bullying is because it's the other big human rights problem in New Zealand. When Reece is talking about the prisons, 65% of the people in our prisons are either in prison for serious violence offending or for breach of prohibition orders, protection orders. Yeah, you know, and a hell of a lot of the others are now in for remand, which they weren't in for only 2 years ago before we reformed the bail laws. And the cost of that actually is $1 billion that we haven't got to spend on fixing the problem. So, you know, this issue around violence in our society, where we are the worst, or nearly the worst in the OECD on just about every measure, is really important. And I've seen it both in my bullying work in schools, but also I'm a member of the steering committee of Project Respect, which is the group working inside the New Zealand Defence Forces to improve issues around gender equity and eliminate sexual harassment and violence. And it's really interesting that that area is the one area that the New Zealand Army does not lead the world in terms of non-discrimination. So the New Zealand Army does lead the world in GLBTI and a whole lot of other areas around Indigenous people, as you might expect, but we just had a gap about gender. And when I was down in Burnham, and I also had another patron, I was the patron of the Limited Service Volunteer Force down there, and I asked the padre, what do you think it is that we have this blind spot about violence towards women and girls? And it's not just in the army, right? And he said to me, he was a Brit, he said, well, you know, class is Britain's problem, race is America's problem, but gender's New Zealand's. And he said to me, you know that, David, because you know how the conversation changes when women leave the room in New Zealand. And, you know, that reality that if they're going to change this sort of culture, it's up to men and boys to change their attitude towards girls and women if we're actually going to change the sort of things. You know, when you see those college boys sort of called out last week, actually that's going on not just in schools but in places all over New Zealand all the time, and that's why we end up with the violence we've got. And I'll talk to you a bit about my journey to understanding that as I go through. So the first thing is, what I know about safety comes from DuPont, not from anything else. So I was really lucky when I was at Fletcher's. We in the late 80s, we went to Wellington, Delaware, to the headquarters of DuPont, and we left New Zealand being told by the Department of Labour that the part of Fletcher's I was part of was the third safest employer in New Zealand. And we got to Wellington and we found out we were where DuPont was in 1927. Okay? And we got told a couple of other things by DuPont. We got told, in God we trust, everyone else brings data. We got told your best workers kill themselves. They go and clean the vent or do something to get the product out. And we got told there's no trade-off between profit and safety. In fact, the things you have to do to improve profit will improve safety. And this curve here, which they call the Bradley curve, just makes the point that you cannot supervise yourself ultimately to safety. You have to get cultural change to get safety. And I'll come to the next chart, which is the pyramid, which is really important in terms of thinking about how you fix things. So the critical thing about DuPont is, yes, they worry about fatalities, lost time injuries, recordable injuries, and near misses, but they treat those as lagging indicators, not the things that are going to really make the difference. Because if you focus down at the at-risk behaviours, the gaps in operational discipline, and the lack of leadership, that's when you get change. So an at-risk behaviour in the context of school bullying would be put-downs of gay, lesbian people or disabled people or girls, and all these things, similar things going back to the Queen's word, it's a lack of respect. So before you get to these issues around consent and rape, you deal with respect first. And that's common respect of the difference, exactly what the Queen said. If we respect each other and each other's communities, we'll be safer, we'll be more peaceful. So this sort of thinking was a big part of how we then approached an issue in New Zealand rugby. And it's been fascinating and frustrating, actually, in the work we've been doing in school bullying, which we've been now doing for 5 years, that we're still struggling to get the system to actually take responsibility in the way rugby took responsibility for its thing. We've got ministries saying to us, we can't control what goes on in every school. Well, rugby couldn't either. But this applies to 2,500 schools, 650 rugby clubs at the time, 27 provincial rugby unions, 5 Super Rugby teams, and the All Blacks. None of whom the New Zealand Rugby Union really controlled. In fact, the provinces controlled the rugby union. And this began when players died. You know, and I'd be rung on a Sunday or a Monday and told that so-and-so had died. And people were saying, we can't do anything about this. And in terms of that leadership thing, we said, no, we can do something about this, and we're going to do something about this. And we worked with ACC to develop Rugby Smart. The exciting thing right now is that the New Zealand Rugby Union has just launched Rugby Smart 2, which has a whole section around respect and responsibility, which is absolutely designed to address some of the issues that the union has had with women and girls. So there's work going on. So the really important thing with this was the danger areas in rugby were the scrum and the tackle. But using the DuPont thinking, we worked out that if we could actually convince the coaches about safe scrummaging was winning scrummaging and safe tackling was winning tackling, we'd win. And we also worked out that the coaches were the key group we had to address. So within 12 months, and this has been sustained, we dropped spinal injuries by 89% compared to the previous 25 years. And in terms of the investment, ACC got $21 back for every dollar they invested. Now what we're saying now is we want to see this thinking in the prevention of sexual violence, family violence, and violence in our schools. You know, we could, with a very small investment, attack the issues around those things in our school. And just put that in context, without counting the prison system, violence and abuse is costing us somewhere near $3 billion a year. And we spend less than $25 million trying to prevent it. You know, so, and the reforms that were announced last week, which we totally support what Minister Adams and Minister Tolley are leading in terms of the reforms around sexual violence and family violence, they're largely focused on what you do after it's happened. So they're remedial. You know, they're about how do we get more and more women reporting, how do we get more and more men and boys going through the system. And it's not just men and boys on girls, there's also a significant amount of sexual violence towards men and boys. So the thing that I think is important to understand about bullying, and I think, you know, I sort of say this, I'll talk right at the end about the stories we're hearing from Holocaust survivors, even in New Zealand. But bullying, whether it's done by countries, or it's done by terrorists, or it's done by people in your workplace, or in school, it's a means to an end. It's about asserting your power over someone else. And the really, really scary thing is if you don't stand up against it, it works. Okay? See, often successful, bullies are perceived as popular. But helps maintain their status and increase their status over time. They need to other someone, to put someone down in order to feel better about themselves. That's what it's about. It's about power, and they need an audience. Okay? They do target people who are submissive, insecure, physically weak, or in a low power position. That's why you get GLBTI, that's why you get women, that's why you get disabled people. I mean, intellectually disabled people, near 100% of them are bullied, even today in New Zealand schools. You know, and that's a country, by the way, that when I was at Special Olympics, New Zealand came out first by some margin of countries surveyed by Gallup in terms of its attitude towards inclusion of people with intellectual disability. So we've got the attitude, but we haven't got the do. And that's an important thing. And they need witnesses. Bullies need people to see it. So this is a bit of work that Professor Christine Samavali from Finland did. And actually I think, while this was about school bullying, I think you can actually find these groups in just about any sort of bullying. So you could put this in a global political sense, or you could put it in the schoolyard. But this is pretty well what happens. And the really scary thing about it is that only 17% of people stand up. And whether it's people who are victims of torture in the worst situations you can imagine, or whether it's kids in schoolyards, the thing that does the most harm, in their words, is no one stood up for me. Not the pain, not the thing, not everything else, that no one stood up for me. And if you think about going back into the 40s, young New Zealanders stood up against some of the biggest bullies in the world, and they stood up quite explicitly in World War II to defend human rights and democracy. And if they hadn't, we would have been in a very different world. But what the Holocaust survivors are telling us at the moment, and I've talked to them in Australia and in New Zealand, is they are hearing right now, around the world and in their countries, the sort of words they heard as young children in Germany in 1930, 1931, 1932 and 1933. Words they couldn't believe they would ever hear in their life again. Words they thought New Zealand and Australia and other countries had learned about the cost of allowing. Right? And I'm not talking about free speech or hate speech here, I'm just talking about standing up against people who try and other people, whoever the other are. So one of the really important things is to understand that your behaviour matters. So firstly, just that the defended victims do immediately better than undefended victims, but also that point I already made, that in the long term, the greatest harm felt by anyone is that I valued so little to you, my dignity mattered so little to you, that you didn't stand up for me. And this really just brings us to the last little bit. So the Holocaust survivors are telling us this today. I was lucky enough in October to be in a room in Sydney at a Jewish museum. I just happened along on a Sunday afternoon and the door was open. And there was a 95-year-old Holocaust survivor who was told us after I got there, a group of about 20 Australian schoolgirls aged about 14 and 15. Now this guy had survived Auschwitz and Buchenwald and had been on the death march out of Auschwitz. Had escaped from Buchenwald and then been caught again in France and sent back to Auschwitz. And he was 27 kilos when the Americans found him. And he was the most positive man about life I've ever come across in my life. He was extraordinary. He didn't mention, other than about the time I have, where he was in the war. He spent most of his time talking to those kids about the words, what it was like to be a 13-year-old boy in Nazi Germany. How he was, at 13, just one of the boys. And by 14 he was a Jew. he wasn't allowed at school. He was actually sent by his parents to a school across Germany as if he was a Gentile. And he successfully went through school, but he dealt with all of that. So he was saying quite explicitly that the words he's hearing political leaders and others talk today are exactly the words he heard as a young German. And I think the Germans, almost more than anyone, have actually worked some of these problems out. I think it's partly why you see them leading in a number of fronts now. Their constitution starts with Article 1 of the Basic Law, which says the dignity of every person in Germany is inviolate, and it is the duty of the state and every person in Germany to defend that dignity. I think that's a bit of a lesson learned from what happened in the 30s when they didn't. Second thing, there's just Justice Learned Hand. So Justice Learned Hand, apart from being the judge with the best name in the world, was an American judge who in 1944 in Central Park spoke to 1 million Americans about the spirit of liberty. And he talked about how the biggest problem in the world generally was men who were too certain that they were right. And there's a corollary to that too, which in my time what I've come to realise is often the worst human rights harm is done by people who are absolutely certain they're doing good. Right? It's a really horrible reality. But he basically reminded us that it doesn't matter what's in our law, in our constitution, if we have one written or unwritten, or in our laws, it's what's in our hearts and what we do with our hands that matters, and what we do with our mouths to speak up against it. Because the bottom line is, for those of you that don't immediately recognise it, is Alexander Solzhenitsyn from the Gulag Archipelago. That the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And it's very true, very important to understand that in most of these situations that we've had in the world where things have gone wrong, it's not a whole lot of rotten apples, it's also a rotten apple barrel. And both these things are playing together to cause harm to us all. So we live in very challenging times, but we live in a nation that is a great nation and has stood up before, and I am certain will stand up again for people and do its bit. But we can do our bit with our children in our schools. We can do our bit if we're men and boys by respecting women and girls in a way we don't. I mean, you know, when that padre said to me, David, you know this because you know what happens to the conversation when women leave the room, I knew exactly what he was saying. Exactly what he was saying. So we need to do this ourselves. And there's so much of that could improve in our mental health stats, in our prison stats, in our educational achievement stats, and our otherwise health stats, if we could do this. So that to me is the biggest challenge we have, and we can all be part of fixing it. Thank you.
Have we got some time for questions? We have time for some questions. Reese and Beach.
David, what advice would you have for former All Black Ellie Williams in this situation you find yourself in?
Well, I mean, it's a challenge for those players, but I'd actually go and find somewhere in the community to do something good. I don't know if Ellie's already done that or not. I know plenty of All Blacks who do, but I don't. You know, I think that he. You know, you do have particular responsibilities when you have that sort of profile, and I think you know, getting out there and working in the community with people who are, you know, like you were talking about the prisoners. I mean, the main reason I know so much about Rumataka is that Gretchen was my wife, was a reader with the Howard League over the last 2 years, and going into Rumataka, and dealing with a person who was had killed someone, but he was illiterate. and really, you can see when her just opened her eyes, opened my eyes, to the change that one person doing something with one person can make.
Richard, please.
Yep. Yeah. So I mean, one of the most wonderful things about both the situation of Muslims and Jews in New Zealand is that they actually are amongst each other's greatest supporters, because they both have their children in this country attacked because of what they're wearing in this country. So I've been in the mosque at Ramadan here with members of the Jewish community, and we've sort of sat around saying, how many countries in the world does this happen? But we cannot be complacent about the othering. And you're absolutely right. In New Zealand, in terms of the religious stuff that goes on, it tends to be around Jewish people and Muslim people. And it tends to be inflamed by something that's happening outside the country. So the Jewish New Zealanders' children found themselves being attacked when the Israelis were in Gaza, in a way. Then something happens with terrorists, it's the Muslim terrorists, it's the other way. And, I've got my uncle, William, he's Irish, was the surgeon in charge of the A&E ward of the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast from 1967 to 1987. And I remember going to see him in 1985 and saying, Uncle William, is there anywhere I shouldn't go? And I got the death stare. And he said, David, you've got more chance of getting killed by a car in London than by a bullet, a bomb or a car in Belfast. Don't let the bastards own you. And, that's the spirit we've got to have. Not it's fundamental, whoever they are, these totalitarian, whoever they are, own us.
Thank you, David.
Take a sit down. We'll go this way.
David, you've put down a challenge and given us a lot to think about. You've indicated how we need to think outside the square, and you've shown us some ways that we can do those things. So thank you, and I'd like to make a small presentation to you.
Thanks very much.
And Club, if we now thank David.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Stephen. In conclusion, members with interesting events. Wild Ideas Wellington Zoo on Wednesday the 5th of April, and then please a number of people to go to the district conference would be very good, which is the Anzac weekend 21-23 April. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll go back one then. In speakers in advance, next week we've got Professor Costner, Health and Wellbeing in Wellington, Can We Do Better? And then on the 3rd, the other 3 clubs, where we're Sydney, Auckland and Melbourne, and where we're going to talk about Project Hope, which is with UNICEF, the Asian Development Bank, funding 3 new vaccines to prevent to help 100,000 people across the Pacific, as I say, on the 3rd of April. In conclusion, also on this slide, this day in history, on the 20th of March 1834, New Zealand's first official flag was chosen, and it is the flag on the bottom right-hand side. Came out after 3 designs, and 25 Northern Chiefs sanctioned this design. See you when we can. So thank you to Ian, and thank you to David. To everybody else, see you when we can in the next few weeks. Don't forget our theme is Rotary Serving Humanity. Thank you very much.